Is there a form to narcissism? If you tried to imagine it, what would you see? Does it make a sound? What architecture could evoke the pathological tendency to remain hidden within oneself? Such a place, such a structure, by nature could not exist in the real world, but it absolutely could in the world of the dream, where there are no bounds, in the mind of a very talented writer, the mind of Anaïs Nin. The Cuban-French author and diarist would poignantly describe that environment like this. The house had the shape of an egg, and it was carpeted with cotton and windowless. One slept in the down and heard through the shell the street organ and the apple vendor who could not find the bell. She led me into the House of Incest. It was the only house which was not included in the 12 houses of the zodiac. The rooms were chained together by steps. No room was on a level with another, and all the steps were deeply worn. There were windows between the rooms, little spying-eyed windows, so that one might talk in the dark from room to room without seeing each other's face. The rooms were filled with the rhythmic heaving of the sea, coming from many seashells. The windows gave out on a static sea, where immobile fishes had been glued to painted backgrounds. Everything had been made to stand still in the House of Incest, because they all had such a fear of movement and warmth, such a fear that all love and all life should flow out of reach and be lost. Everything had been made to stand still, and everything was rotting away. The sun had been nailed in the roof of the sky, and the moon beaten deep into its oriental niche. The House of Incest is a fortress of narcissism. Its name is also shared by the prose poem that intended to document it. Anaïs Nin published The House of Incest in 1936 after compiling her dreams for a year. The House of Incest is arguably Nin's magnum opus, though she is more well known for her diary, which spans more than 15,000 pages over 150 volumes. House is the concentration of the symbols, themes, and motifs which Nin would delineate in those 15,000 pages. House may not be a diary entry, but it is the most honest descent into Nin's subconscious that we will ever get. It is argued by scholars that Nin's diaries progressively became more redundant, more convoluted, and more self-serving over the course of her life, and lacked the catharsis present in her earlier work. It is possible that Anaïs Nin entered into the House of Incest and never really came back out. Anaïs Nin is all too often considered a narcissist, and her body of work is referred to figuratively as the cathedral of her ego. But like many madmen and transgressives, Anaïs Nin was not born this way. Her diaries started out as a letter to her father whenever he deserted the family, and the violence and perversion that Nin was exposed to prior to this departure would merge with this desertion to form Nin into a woman who refused to step foot outside of herself. From room to room, I came into the room of paintings, and there sat Lot with his hand upon his daughter's breast, while the city burned behind them, cracking open and falling into the sea. While the city is rent by lightning and spits under the teeth of fire, great blocks of a gaping, ripped city sinking with the horror of obscenity and falling into the sea with the hiss of the eternally damned. No cry of horror from Lot and his daughter, but from the city in flames. Nin described the House of Incest as a woman's season in hell. She was heavily influenced by Rimbaud's own prose poem of the same name. Both pieces represent the archetypal journey into the inferno, into hell, symbolic of the journey into oneself. The purpose is to gain insight, to identify and reconcile the darkest parts of ourselves, and through this meeting, find cohesion. But Nin struggled to find wholeness. Embalmed in her own likeness, the world burns around her, beyond her carefully guarded locus. And so she remains fragmented, like the floating rooms in the egg-shaped house, like different shards of a broken mirror. The incest in the prose poem is shown symbolically through the painting of Lot and his daughter, their inability to exist beyond themselves, and the abhorrence of their desire is reflected by the destruction in the distance, the earth cracking open, the consuming flames. But the deepest interpretation of House is even more regressive than this. The incest the poem seeks to expose is one so advanced that it culminates in becoming incest with oneself, a union which can only end in annihilation. A crucial difference between Rimbaud's Season in Hell and Anaïs's House of Incest is that the tone and texture of House is intrinsically, innately feminine. Hell, normally considered to be in the bowels of the earth, to Nin was the womb, a place she said she spoke from. French feminism is accredited with identifying the woman's writing, écriture féminine, a term first coined by Hélèn Cixous in The Laugh of Medusa. It is writing in a non-structuralist way. House is not written linearly. It stops, waits, and slowly digests its phenomena. Time does not move forward in House, and you can feel that in the writing. It's hermetic. It's suffocating. Contemplation makes the observer stand still. It turns normal communication into poetry, a hallmark of this kind of writing. Écriture féminine is writing from within, from a place of absolute truth, and also created truths. This is why I think Nin thrived in this chosen way of speaking, because women's writing gives the author the dual option to be truthful or deceptive. Unfortunately, House of Incest is prophetic. Nin chose deception, and it led her to self-evasion. Throughout much of her life, she circumvolved truth, turning away from her own healing and redemption. In Nancy Scholler's analysis of Nin's work, she wrote that time and time again, when Anaïs came too close to harrowing realizations in her writing, she spun out into ornate abstractions, never facing things head-on. She spoke from within darkness, a language which brought no lucidity. This language would turn into a labyrinth she could not escape from, the labyrinth being her own diary. House of Incest is the closest to cohesion as Nin got from her descent into herself. From all men I was different, and myself. But I see in you that part of me which is you. I feel you in me. I feel my own voice becoming heavier, as if I were drinking you in. Every delicate thread of resemblance being soldered by fire, and one no longer detects the fissure. The synopses that you will read for House of Incest will often say that the protagonist's main problem is that their ability to love another person is reliant on being able to see their own reflection in that person. Narcissism is not an abundance of the self, but the prohibiting of admittance of others, or the other. The modern philosopher Byung-Chul also describes this problem as it pertains to our current society in his essay, The Agony of Eros. The crisis of love does not derive from too many others, the abundance of choice, so much so as from the erosion of the other, the vanishing of the other. Eros concerns the other in the strong sense, namely, what cannot be encompassed by the regime of the ego. Therefore, in the inferno of the same, erotic experience does not exist. Erotic experience presumes the asymmetry and exteriority of the other. Today we live in an increasingly narcissistic society. Libido is primarily invested in one's own subjectivity. Narcissism is not the same as self-love. The subject of self-love draws a negative boundary between him or herself and the other. The narcissistic subject, on the other hand, never manages to set any clear boundaries. In consequence, the border between the narcissist and the other becomes blurry. The world appears only as adumbrations of the narcissist's self, which is incapable of recognizing the other in his or her otherness. Meaning can exist for the narcissistic self only when it somehow catches sight of itself. Han too associates narcissism with being engulfed in hellfire. Anaïs not being able to detect the fissure, by Han's logic, is her inability to accept the other being the force which pulls her out of her orbit into the world of distinction so she can develop naturally. She must be willing to brush up against the rigidity of the other. Not so coincidentally, in the latter half of the poem, Nin says, "I turned the corner too quickly and bruised myself against my madness." I believe Nin, young and not yet cognizant of her trauma or her powers of seduction, was able to lay herself bare in House of Incest. Anaïs's narcissism would come to act as a tyrannical force later in her life, through adjusting, revising, and controlling the narratives of her diaries, as well as her fiction. But when she wrote House, she seems to, for even if it is a moment, truly desire redemption. Fear of madness. Only the fear of madness will drive us out of the precincts of our solitude, out of the sacredness of our solitude. The fear of madness will burn down the walls of our secret house and send us out into the world, seeking warm contact. Worlds self-made and self-nourished are so full of ghosts and monsters. In the poem, she also asks for absolution. She uses that word. And the poem ends with an armless woman who lost her appendages because of her compulsion to cling to things. And this armless woman leads us away from the House of Incest, its artificial, eternal night, into daylight. Anaïs knew that if there was any hope for her to be able to escape the House of Incest, it would be through communion with the other. And the other takes the form of death. Hahn uses Lars von Trier's Melancholia as an example of a literal, fatal collision with the other, which brings positive change and rebirth in the depressive main character, Justine. Rimbaud, too, in his Season in Hell, pleads for death, calls for plagues, executioners, and misfortune. Anaïs knows contact with the other would be death-dealing. Though this death would heal her, bring rebirth after death, Nancy Scholar noted, Anaïs is more terrified of this new life than the prospect of dying. And so she continued to move in circles, live fragmented, because the fear of new life is the fear of change, which would oust her from being the head and ruler of her universe. Don't say anything, because I see that you understand me, and I am afraid of your understanding. I have such a fear of finding another like myself, and such a desire to find one. I am so utterly lonely, but I also have such a fear that my isolation be broken through, and I no longer be the head and ruler of my universe. I am in great terror of your understanding by which you penetrate into my world, and then I stand revealed, and I have to share my kingdom with you. House of Incest was arguably Anaïs's most successful penetrative work of fiction, and the beginning of the poem beautifully illustrates how this plunge into narcissism originated from a sincere desire to know oneself, to come out as a female artist, and to find placement in the world. My first vision of earth was water-veiled. I am of the race of men and women who see all things through this curtain of sea, and my eyes are the color of water. I looked with chameleon eyes upon the changing face of the world, looked with anonymous vision upon my uncompleted self, born full of memories of the bells of the Atlantide, always listening for lost sounds and searching for lost colors, standing forever on the threshold like one troubled with memories, and walking with a swimming stride, ejected from a paradise of soundlessness, cathedrals wavering at the passage of a body, like soundless music, loving without knowingness, moving without effort, in the soft current of water and desire, breathing in an ecstasy of dissolution. I awoke at dawn, thrown up on a rock, the skeleton of a ship choked in its own sails. It is clear that the beginning was innocence, and that the lies and deceit of narcissism came as a response to the horror of the world, from being ejected from the soundlessness of the dream, being so cruelly born, choked, and shipwrecked. If one cannot find a home out in the world, their home will be within themselves, and it will be a heavily guarded sanctum. With the trauma she experienced, abuse and abandonment, of course she would say, I love no one. I love nothing but this absence of pain, this cold, neutral absence of pain. The desire not to move, to turn in circles endlessly, gardens of eggs and a sun tacked to the ceiling so that it may never set, stratified ground, pressed together, melted jewels, alchemized by air and sun and time and space, mixed into mineral fixity, the fixity of fear of death and fear of life. Everything stands still which is terrified to move, to let go of what they still have. And this is the very morbidity that plagues all romantics. Romantics grieve. They have experienced some great loss, the loss of an ideal which all human beings are entitled to. So they strive to either artificially maintain or keep their precious possessions, or they recreate the world for themselves. They recreate it in their image. Your lies are not lies, Sabina. They are arrows flung out of your orbit by the strength of your fantasy. To nourish illusion, to destroy reality, I will help you. It is I who will invent lies for you, and with them we will traverse the world. But behind our lies, I'm dropping Ariadne's golden thread. For the greatest of all joys is to be able to retrace one's lies, to return to the source, and sleep one night a year washed of all superstructures. And this is where I defend Anaïs. The drive of the romantic and the narcissist is not just to evade, but it is also to create. To create is to have the courage to be able to reshape the world as one likes. The romantic is also the optimist, the opportunist, the entrepreneur. If Nin did not have this reaction to her dismal upbringing, if Nin did not choose herself, we would not have House of Incest. That journey would never have been made in the first place because she would never have cared to make it. We would not have Henry and June, Under a Glass Bell, the early diaries. Never would there have been written down some of the most striking, disorienting, sybaritic prose which would help to define women's aesthetics in writing in a male-dominated literary sphere. I myself have received innumerable blessings from that self-obsessed woman, from that narcissist. Thank God she was who she was. Thank God for the woman who had the courage or nerve to contemplate her own thoughts, to give value to them. Though the diaries as a whole decrease in value over the years, her observations on the world, when she isn't compulsively defending herself for some reason, those observations are fascinating to read. And I applaud the care and attention that she put into her thoughts, which has always been discouraged by bourgeois society. In Joan Didion's essay on keeping a notebook, she also outlines this problem. We are brought up in the ethic that others, any others, all others, are by definition more interesting than ourselves. Taught to be diffident, just this side of self-effacing. Only the very young and the very old may recount their dreams at breakfast, dwell upon self, interrupt with memories of beach picnics and favorite Liberty Lawn dresses and the rainbow trout in a creek near Colorado Springs. The rest of us are expected, rightly, to affect absorption in other people's favorite dresses, other people's trout. Nin could make an average day extraordinary through her perspective, revision or not, lies or not. Just casual study of her surroundings or interpreting information from books or conversations she's had with her friends is high-hanging fruit. In defense of her narcissism, she at least has a beautiful mind to be obsessed over, and I'd be keen to listen to her talk about a glass of water for an hour. Though her short stories often are ambiguous, with half-baked characters, the prose alone is intoxicating to read, seductive, even if it's just for the word's sake. It's what they used to call literary jewelry, purple patches, back in the late 1800s, very much like the writing of Oscar Wilde or Nabokov. Every sense, including the one in your mind, is sated. What I'm saying is, the best writing comes from somebody self-obsessed. You have to know yourself, know your voice, to write well. To write well is an accuracy of observation, even in the face of the ineffable. And the mastery of language denotes the mastery of self, as Joan would say. The plunge into oneself, though that wounded Nin greatly, encouraged her to write in the first place. It wasn't just a call out to her father, but it was also a way to reaffirm her identity or to have control over her identity. And the faith, that delusional belief in one's own ability and the value of their existence in the first place, is indispensable to any artist. To see oneself and the world around them is an affirmation of meaning. It is a less lonely world and a more beautiful one, but you must pull your face out of the water and say goodbye to the Atlantide because you are human, and if you stay below too long, you'll drown.